Welcome to a story of struggle, hope, and unexpected friendship. Jack, a veteran battling his past, finds himself targeted by Officer Turner, a powerful figure in a small town. But when Martha and Henry, an elderly couple facing their own hardships, welcome Jack into their home, they begin to form a bond that could change all their lives. As Turner's relentless vendetta threatens to destroy the fragile peace they found, Jack must find the courage to fight back, risking everything to protect the new family he's come to love. But will it be enough to overcome the past and build a future? Or will Turner's influence tear them apart? Comment below with your thoughts and where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and the strength of the human spirit. Stick around to see how this powerful tale unfolds. The sun crept through the lace curtains of Martha Johnson's small living room, casting a soft glow over the worn furniture. She moved slowly, carefully with each step as she shuffled from the kitchen to the living room, where her husband Henry lay in his hospital bed. The steady hum of his breathing filled the quiet space, a rhythm she had grown accustomed to over the years. Henry, once a tall, broad-shouldered man, now lay immobile, his body a shadow of its former strength. His gaze followed Martha as she approached, his eyes still as sharp as ever. Even though he couldn't speak, they had a way of communicating through shared glances and the small gestures that came with decades of love. Martha placed a gentle hand on Henry's shoulder, her touch as familiar to him as the feel of the morning sun on his face. "I'm heading to the store, Henry," she said softly, adjusting the blanket that covered his thin frame. "I'll pick up everything we need." Henry's expression softened into what might have been a smile, a wrinkle forming at the corners of his eyes. He tried to lift his hand, and though the movement was minimal, Martha held it as if it were a precious gift. She pressed a kiss on his knuckles, feeling the rough skin against her lips. "I won't be long," she promised, "and I'll be back before you know it." Martha straightened with a quiet wince, the ache in her back flaring up as it did most mornings. She walked to the door, taking a final glance at Henry before stepping outside. The brisk air was a stark contrast to the warmth of their small home, and she wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, feeling the chill settling into her bones. As she walked toward Wacth's grocery, she passed neighbors going about their routines. Most gave her a brief nod, their expressions distant. Martha was used to this kind of interaction, the polite distance that separated her from the rest of the town. It didn't bother her as much anymore. But on mornings like this, she felt the weight of loneliness settle in. She clutched the crumpled shopping list in her hand, Henry's shaky handwriting spelling out the essentials: bread, milk, eggs. And then, at the bottom, the one item she dreaded buying most: adult diapers. Her heart tightened with a familiar pang of embarrassment, but she squared her shoulders, reminding herself that Henry depended on her. Wacth's Grocery was one of the few remaining businesses in town that still felt like a relic of another time. Its aisles were narrow, shelves stacked high with goods that barely changed from one season to the next. The bell above the door jingled as Martha entered, the sound echoing through the nearly empty store. She scanned the familiar aisles, nodding briefly to Emma White, the manager, who was behind the counter, chatting with a customer. Emma glanced at Martha and offered a tight-lipped smile, her eyes drifting away almost immediately. Martha knew that Emma meant well, but was always eager to avoid conversations that might become too personal. Martha headed to the hygiene aisle, her steps slower than before. Her joints ached as she bent down to pick up the pack of adult diapers, the plastic crinkling loudly in her hands. She flinched, looking around as if the sound might draw unwanted attention, but the store remained quiet, with only a few early morning shoppers browsing the aisles. With the package tucked under her arm, Martha made her way to the checkout, keeping her head down. Her mind wandered back to Henry, to the days when he was strong enough to help her carry groceries, when they laughed together without a care in the world. She missed those days fiercely, even as she did her best to accept what life had become. As she reached the checkout line, she let out a small sigh of relief. It would be over soon, she thought, but as she placed the diapers on the conveyor belt, she heard the jingle of the bell above the door, followed by a familiar booming voice that made her freeze in place. "Morning, Emma. Lovely day, isn't it?" It was Officer Ray Turner, the local police officer who always seemed to have a comment for everyone he met. He was loud, confident, and the kind of man who never seemed to understand the impact of his words. He took his place in line behind Martha, chatting easily with the customer behind him. Martha kept her gaze fixed on the counter, praying that Turner wouldn't notice her. But she felt his presence like a weight on her shoulders, and her grip on the edge of the counter tightened. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched Emma scan her items, each beep of the scanner punctuating the silence between them. And then, just as Martha thought she might escape unnoticed, Turner's voice cut through the air. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Buying diapers at your age, huh? Poor thing, can't even take care of herself anymore." The words hit Martha like a physical blow, and she froze, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. A few customers turned to look, some stifling their laughter, others casting curious glances her way. Martha kept her eyes on the counter, willing herself not to cry, but the humiliation burned deep inside her. Emma glanced up, her face tightening with discomfort, but she said nothing, continuing to scan the last of Martha's items. Martha struggled to steady her breathing, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the worn linoleum floor beneath her feet. But before the situation could spiral further, a voice spoke up, a voice Martha hadn't expected to hear. "That's enough." The voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the awkward silence like a knife. Martha turned slightly, catching sight of the person who had spoken, Jack Collins, the cashier she had seen behind the counter just moments before. He had stepped forward, his expression hard as he met Turner's surprised gaze. Turner looked taken aback, his smile faltering. "What's your problem, kid?" Jack crossed his arms, standing his ground. "My problem is people who think it's okay to humiliate others. Show some respect." A murmur rippled through the small crowd, and Martha's eyes widened in shock. She glanced at Jack, who had become her unexpected defender, his shoulders squared against Turner's authority. Turner recovered quickly, a sneer curling his lips. "Watch yourself, Collins. You don't want to mess with me." But Jack didn't back down. He held Turner's glare, his jaw set in a determined line. "Just leave her alone, okay? She's done nothing to you." Martha watched the confrontation, her heart pounding in her chest. No one had stood up for her like this in years, and she didn't know how to respond. She caught Jack's eye for a brief moment, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning back to the officer. The moment stretched on, thick with tension, until Turner finally scoffed and turned away. "You'll regret this, Collins," he muttered, throwing one last glare at Jack before stalking out of the store. Martha felt the breath she'd been holding escape in a shaky sigh. She looked at Jack, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack shrugged, but there was a softness in his eyes. "It's the least I could do, ma'am. Don't let people like him get you down." As Martha gathered her groceries and made her way out of the store, she felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Gratitude, fear, and a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jack had just made a sacrifice for her, one that might cost him more than either of them could anticipate. The bell above the door jingled as Martha left White's grocery, clutching her paper bag close to her chest. She walked quickly, her heart still pounding from the scene that had just unfolded. She felt exposed, like everyone in town would now know what had happened at the grocery store, how she had been mocked, how she had become a spectacle. But more than that, she couldn't shake the memory of Jack Collins standing up to Officer Turner on her behalf. She paused halfway down the street, glancing back at the store's familiar red awning. The name White's was painted in weathered letters, a constant presence in her life, but now it felt like the place where everything had changed, a place where her private struggles had become painfully public. Yet amidst the shame, a flicker of gratitude warmed her chest. She wanted to go back, to find Jack and thank him properly for his kindness, but she was too shaken. Martha took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and kept walking, knowing Henry was waiting at home. As she reached their little house, Martha pushed open the front door, letting the familiar sense of lavender and the faint aroma of last night's dinner wash over her. She set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and hurried into the living room, where Henry's bed was placed near the window. "Henry," she said, her voice wavering as she took a seat beside him, "you wouldn't believe what happened today." Henry's eyes, sharp and attentive, focused on her face, and Martha felt a lump rise in her throat. It had been years since Henry could speak, but his expressions still conveyed a lifetime of wisdom and empathy. There was this young man, a cashier at the grocery store. He stood up for me. When that officer made those awful remarks, he told him to stop. She paused, her hands trembling as she smoothed Henry's blanket. No one's done that for me in a long time. Henry's lips twitched, the smallest sign of a smile. His gaze seemed to ask her more about the man, about what it meant to her. Martha squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses that had once held hers with such strength. I didn't even know what to say to him. I just left. But he lost his job for it, Henry. I think he might have done it knowing what it would cost him. I don't know what to do. For a long moment, they sat in silence, Martha's mind racing with the possibilities. She had never been one to get involved in other people's lives, preferring to keep her head down and manage her own burdens. But this time the guilt gnawed at her, and she wondered if there might be some way to make it right. The next day, Martha woke up before dawn, the restless thoughts of the previous evening pushing her out of bed. After helping Henry with his morning routine, she brewed a pot of coffee, trying to calm her nerves. As the sun rose, she decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to see Jack, to thank him, to offer some kind of apology or support for what he had lost because of her. She arrived at White's grocery just after opening. Emma White stood behind the counter, arranging some newspapers, her expression tense as she glanced up and saw Martha approaching. "Morning, Emma," Martha said, her voice polite but strained. "Is Jack here today?" Emma's face tightened. She set down the stack of papers and folded her hands on the counter, glancing around as if to ensure no one else could hear. "No, Martha, he's not here. He's been let go." The words hit Martha like a punch to the gut. She had known it might happen, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. "Emma," Martha began, struggling to find the right words. "Did it have to do with what happened yesterday? The argument with Officer Turner?" Emma shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Martha's gaze. "You know how this town is, Martha. It's small, and people talk. After what Jack did, Turner filed a formal complaint, and then some of the customers, they didn't like what he said. They called in, and I didn't have a choice." "But he was defending me," Martha pressed, her voice growing more urgent. "He shouldn't be punished for that." Emma sighed, finally meeting Martha's eyes. "I know, Martha. I know. But Turner's got a lot of pull around here. And Jack, he's been struggling for a while. It was easier to let him go than to fight it. I feel terrible, but my hands are tied." Martha felt a bitter taste in her mouth. She wanted to argue, to make Emma see how unfair this was, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. The town's unspoken rules ran deep, and Jack was just another casualty. With a heavy heart, she thanked Emma and left the store, feeling the weight of the injustice settle in her chest. She couldn't let Jack face the consequences alone. She had to find him, to make sure he was okay. Martha spent the next few days searching for Jack in the places she thought he might be: behind the grocery store, near the gas station, anywhere that might offer some shelter from the chill October air. She walked the streets until her legs ached, each time returning home to Henry with a heavier heart. Finally, on the third day, she spotted a familiar figure huddled on a bench near the town's old bus stop. Jack sat with his head bowed, a small cardboard sign propped up next to him. His clothes were rumpled, his face pale and gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days. For a moment, Martha hesitated, wondering if she should turn back. But then she remembered the strength in Jack's eyes when he had stood up for her, and she took a deep breath, walking forward until she stood in front of him. "Jack," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence of the early morning. Jack looked up, his expression startled. When he saw Martha, he quickly lowered his gaze, as if ashamed to be seen like this. "Mrs. Johnson," he muttered, his voice rough. I didn't expect to see you here." Martha sank down onto the bench beside him, wincing as her joints protested the movement. She ignored the curious stares of passers-by, focusing only on Jack. "I came looking for you," she said. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. And I heard about what happened with your job. Jack let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Yeah, well, not much left to say about that. I made a choice and it cost me. Story of my life. Martha studied him closely, seeing the shadows under his eyes, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. She could see now that this was a man who had been fighting battles long before he met her. Let me buy you a meal, she offered gently. Please, Jack. It's the least I can do. For a moment, Jack looked like he might refuse, but then his shoulders sagged and he nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. All right, Mrs. Johnson, if you insist. They walked together to Fran's Diner, a small greasy spoon where Martha and Henry used to come for breakfast on weekends. The waitress Clara recognized Martha, but didn't comment on Jack's disheveled appearance, though she eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Martha ordered coffee for both of them, along with a plate of pancakes for Jack, who looked almost overwhelmed by the simple gesture of kindness. He ate slowly at first, but as he took each bite, his hunger got the better of him, and he finished the meal with a fervor that brought tears to Martha's eyes. As they sat in the corner booth, Jack began to open up. He spoke haltingly at first, but Martha's patient silence encouraged him to keep going. He told her about his service overseas as a mechanic in the Army, the sense of purpose he had felt back then, and how it had all crumbled when he came back to find his wife had left him. She couldn't handle the distance, Jack said, his voice thick with bitterness. Said she was tired of being alone, not knowing if I'd come back in one piece. I came home to divorce papers and an empty house. Martha listened, her heart aching for this young man who had faced so much. She reached out, placing a gentle hand over his. I know a little about loss, Jack. My Henry. He's been confined to that bed for years now. It's not easy. But we find a way to keep going, don't we? Jack looked at her, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. Yeah, I guess we do. As they finished their meal, Martha made a decision. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before speaking. Jack, why don't you come stay with us for a while? I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm, and you wouldn't have to worry about where you're sleeping at night. Jack stared at her, stunned into silence. Mrs. Johnson, I appreciate the offer, but I can't do that to you. I'd be a burden. Nonsense, Martha said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. You've done enough for me already. Now let me help you. Henry and we could use the company. After a long pause, Jack finally nodded, his eyes misting over. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Jack, Martha replied, a small smile touching her lips. Just come home with me. The next morning, Martha set about preparing the small guest room for Jack, a task she hadn't done since her niece visited a few summers ago. She dusted the furniture and laid out fresh sheets, her mind racing with thoughts of how this new arrangement would work. She hoped Henry would understand, but she knew he would. He always did. When she returned to the living room, Henry's eyes tracked her movements, his brow furrowing slightly as she rearranged a few things near his bed. I met him, Henry, she said, sitting down in the armchair beside him. The young man I told you about, Jack. He lost his job because of what he did for me, and now he doesn't have anywhere to go. I asked him to stay with us for a while. She paused, gauging Henry's reaction. His expression softened, and he blinked slowly, his silent way of telling her that he trusted her decision. Tears welled up in Martha's eyes, and she reached out to hold his hand. I hope this is the right thing to do, Henry, she whispered, but I just couldn't let him face this alone. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Martha stood quickly, smoothing down her dress before opening it. Jack stood on the porch, a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked uncertain, as if he still half expected Martha to change her mind. She offered him a warm smile, gesturing for him to come inside. Welcome, Jack. Let's get you settled. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his gaze sweeping over the small living room and then landing on Henry, who watched them both with keen interest. For a moment, Jack's posture stiffened, as if he felt out of place in this modest home filled with memories and quiet strength. But Martha's gentle encouragement drew him in, and he stepped across the threshold. As Jack moved inside, Martha noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at Henry, a fellow veteran, a man whose life had been shaped by sacrifice and resilience. She led Jack to the guest room, showing him the bed and the few simple comforts she had prepared. "It's not much, but it's warm," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "You can take your time, Jack. Stay as long as you need." Jack set his bag down, looking around the room, his expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I never thought I'd have a place to rest my head again." Martha smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. "Just call me Martha," she said softly. "You're family now." Over the next few days, Jack settled into the rhythm of the Johnson household. He was an early riser, just like Martha, and would often be found on the porch with a cup of coffee when she joined him in the mornings. The quiet camaraderie between them grew as they shared stories of their lives. Jack speaking hesitantly at first, but gradually opening up about the demons that followed him. He told her more about his time in the service, about how the sense of purpose he once felt had dissolved when he returned to civilian life. Martha listened intently, her heart aching for him, and shared her own struggles with Henry's declining health. They found a strange comfort in each other's stories, each recognizing a familiar pain in the other. Meanwhile, Jack began to make himself useful around the house. He fixed the creaky porch steps that Martha had been avoiding, patched a leak in the roof, and even repaired Henry's old wheelchair, making it easier for Martha to maneuver him around the house. Every small task seemed to give Jack a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and Martha watched with quiet joy as he seemed to regain a little of the confidence he had lost. The bond between Jack and Henry deepened as well. Each day, Jack would spend time beside Henry's bed, reading aloud from an old book of war stories or sharing anecdotes from his own time in the army. He spoke to Henry as if he were speaking to an old friend, and Henry, for his part, seemed to thrive on the companionship, his eyes brightening whenever Jack was near. One evening, as Martha listened to Jack reading to Henry, she felt a swell of gratitude. It had been so long since there had been laughter in their home, and now, because of this unexpected visitor, the shadows seemed a little less heavy. But even as Jack found a sense of belonging with the Johnsons, the world outside their home had not forgotten the incident at White's Grocery. Officer Ray Turner noticed Jack's presence at the Johnson house, and his casual harassment began to take on a more personal tone. He would park his patrol car across the street, watching the house as Martha and Jack went about their day. At first, Martha tried to ignore it, but she saw the way Jack tensed whenever Turner was near. He had lost so much already because of his stand against Turner, and she worried that he might lose even more. One afternoon, as Martha was returning from a walk to the mailbox, Turner approached her on the sidewalk. He offered her a smile that didn't reach his eyes, leaning casually against his car. "Afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," he said, tipping his hat. "I've noticed you've got a new guest. Hope he's not causing you any trouble." Martha felt a prickle of anger but kept her expression calm. "He's a good man, Officer Turner. He's done nothing but help me and Henry." Turner's smile widened, but there was a coldness in his gaze. "You know, some people in town have been saying that he's taking advantage of your kindness. Wouldn't want to see you get hurt, Mrs. Johnson." Martha squared her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "Jack's been a blessing to us. He's welcome in my home, as long as he needs to be." Turner's expression soured, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Watch yourself, Mrs. Johnson. That boy's trouble. You'd do well to keep your distance." He stepped back, giving her a mocking salute before getting into his car. As he drove away, Martha stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. She knew that Turner's words were a threat, but she was determined not to let him scare her into turning Jack away. When she returned inside, Jack noticed her shaken expression and frowned. "Martha, what happened?" She hesitated, but then decided to tell him the truth. "Turner was here. He thinks you're taking advantage of us. He wants me to ask you to leave." Jack's face darkened, his jaw clenching with barely suppressed anger. "I'm sorry, Martha. I never wanted to bring trouble into your life. Maybe I should go." "No," Martha said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You belong here, Jack. Don't let him make you think otherwise. Henry and we're better with you here. Don't let him scare you away." Jack looked at her, the tension in his expression easing slightly. He nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. Thank you, Martha. I don't know what I'd do without you and Henry. She squeezed his arm, offering him a small, encouraging smile. We stand together, Jack, no matter what. As the days passed, Turner's harassment continued, but Jack tried to focus on his growing responsibilities at the Johnson home. He found small ways to make Martha's life easier, installing handrails in the bathroom for Henry, fixing the back door that had always been difficult to latch. And Martha began to trust him more and more, finding comfort in his presence. But one evening, as Jack was taking out the trash, Turner drove by slowly, rolling down his window to make another snide comment. Watch your back, Collins, he called, his voice carrying through the quiet street. You never know when you'll run out of friends. Jack clenched his fists, his first instinct to confront Turner. But then he remembered Martha's words, her faith in him, and he forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the warmth of the Johnson home, the place that had become his sanctuary. Later that night, as Jack sat by Henry's bed, reading from an old copy of the Red Badge of Courage, he found himself opening up to Martha about his fears. I'm scared, Martha, he admitted, his voice low. Scared that if I stay, I'll bring more trouble your way. But I don't want to leave. I don't want to go back to being alone. Martha rested a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with determination. You're not alone, Jack, and we're not either. Not anymore. We'll face whatever comes together. Turner can't take that from us. As Jack looked up, meeting Henry's calm, steady gaze, he felt a small flame of hope rekindle inside him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that for the first time in a long while, he had a reason to keep fighting. As the fall days shortened and the leaves turned gold and crimson, Jack found himself settling into a new routine in the Johnson household. He continued helping Martha with chores around the house, feeling a sense of purpose in the work. It was a welcome distraction from the uneasy feeling that settled in his chest whenever he thought about Turner's threats. But there was a part of Jack that knew he couldn't avoid his problems forever. One crisp morning, Martha found Jack on the porch, staring out at the horizon, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. She joined him, carrying a plate of freshly baked biscuits. She set the plate down on the table between them, watching him closely. You seem troubled, Jack, she said gently. You've been quieter lately. Jack took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It's just, I feel like I'm waiting for something bad to happen, Martha. Like any minute, Turner's going to show up with some excuse to make my life harder. Martha reached out, covering Jack's hand with her own. You don't have to face him alone. We're in this together, remember? He managed a small smile, but his gaze remained distant. I know, Martha, but I can't keep relying on you and Henry forever. I need to find a way to stand on my own 2 feet. A thought seemed to strike him, and he turned to Martha with newfound determination. I think I'm ready to get help, Martha. For the drinking, I mean. There's an AA meeting in town. I looked it up last night. The sincerity in Jack's voice touched Martha deeply, and she squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of pride. That's a brave step, Jack, and it's not easy to ask for help. I'll be with you every step of the way. As Jack nodded, a small weight seemed to lift from his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope, fragile but growing. That afternoon, Martha drove Jack to his first meeting. The community center wasn't far, but Jack's hands shook slightly as they gripped the dashboard of Martha's old car. He kept glancing out the window, as if half expecting to see Turner's patrol car tailing them, but the streets were quiet, and the town seemed almost peaceful in the autumn light. When they arrived, Martha parked outside the squat brick building, turning to Jack with a warm smile. You've got this, Jack, and I'll be right here when you're done. Jack hesitated, staring at the doors of the center, where a small sign read, Alcoholics Anonymous. All are welcome. He swallowed hard, then nodded. Thank you, Martha, for everything. As Jack stepped inside, Martha watched him go, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She knew how much this meant to him, and she prayed silently that he would find the strength he needed to stay on the course. While Jack attended the meeting, Martha sat in the car, knitting a scarf for Henry and trying to calm her restless thoughts. She thought back to all the struggles she and Henry had faced over the years. The endless hospital visits, the nights she stayed awake listening to Henry's labored breathing, the times she wondered if she could keep going. They had come through it together, and now she believed that Jack could find his own way through the darkness. When Jack finally emerged from the center, he looked exhausted, but there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. He got into the car without a word, but Martha could see the weight of the meeting on his hunched shoulders. "Did it help?" she asked gently as she started the car. Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. "I think so. Hearing other people's stories. It made me realize I'm not alone. Maybe I can do this, Martha." "You can," Martha said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "I believe in you, Jack." As they drove back to the house, Jack felt a sense of cautious optimism, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, he could build a new life here. In the days that followed, Jack continued to attend his meetings, and with each session, he felt a little stronger, a little more in control. Martha supported him in every way she could, offering words of encouragement and keeping Henry company during Jack's absence. Meanwhile, Jack also began looking for work, eager to regain his independence. He applied for maintenance positions at local businesses, and after a few weeks of searching, he finally landed a part-time job as a janitor at the community center where he attended his meetings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start, and it gave him a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. The job brought a routine back into Jack's life, a sense of stability that he desperately needed. He found that the work kept his hands busy and his mind clear, and each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like a step towards reclaiming his life. One evening after a particularly long day of work, Jack came home to find Martha in the kitchen preparing a stew for dinner. The house was filled with the comforting aroma of simmering broth and fresh herbs, and Henry was propped up in his bed, watching the scene with a contented expression. "Smells good in here," Jack said, smiling as he set down his jacket and joined Martha by the stove. She beamed at him, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "It's your favorite, beef stew. I thought you deserved a little celebration for getting the job." Jack chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not much, Martha. Just cleaning floors and changing light bulbs." "It's more than that, Jack," Martha insisted, her voice warm with pride. "You're working hard and you're doing it for yourself. Henry and I couldn't be prouder." Jack glanced over at Henry, who met his gaze with a knowing look. In that moment, Jack felt a surge of gratitude for this home, for those people who had given him a second chance. He took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the kitchen fill him, and realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged. But even as the Johnson household found a new sense of peace, Officer Turner remained a lingering shadow. He would still park outside the house some nights or make snide comments to Jack when he saw him in town. Jack did his best to ignore it, but Martha could see the tension in his face whenever Turner was near. One evening, as Martha stood on the front porch, watching Turner's patrol car slowly roll by, she made a decision. She wouldn't let him continue to intimidate them, not when they had worked so hard to build a new life. She turned to Jack, who had come outside to join her. "I think it's time I had a word with Turner, Jack. It's time he understands that we won't be bullied." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. "Martha, you don't have to do that. I can handle it." "No, Jack," Martha interrupted, her voice firm. "This is our home, our family, and it's time he knew that we're not afraid of him." Jack stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "All right, Martha. Just be careful." She patted his arm with a reassuring smile, then turned to look down the street, where Turner's car had disappeared around a corner. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve held steady. She had fought too hard to let Turner take away the peace they had found. Little did she know her confrontation with Turner would mark the beginning of a series of events that would test them all in ways they never could have imagined. The next morning, Martha stood at the kitchen sink, watching the sunlight filter through the curtains. Her resolve from the previous night had not wavered. She knew what she had to do. As Jack headed out to the community center for his shift, she walked him to the door and offered him a reassuring smile. "Go on now. I'll take care of things here," she said firmly, patting his arm. Jack hesitated, concern shadowing his face. "You sure about this, Martha? I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Her expression softened, and she reached up to touch his cheek gently. "You're family, Jack, and families look out for each other. Don't you worry about me. I've got more fight left in me than Turner realizes." With a nod, Jack left, casting one last worried glance over his shoulder before heading down the street. Martha watched him go, then turned back to the task at hand, determination settling like steel in her spine. Later that day, Martha headed into town, clutching her old leather purse close to her side. She walked past White's grocery, where Emma glanced up from the register and offered her a small, uncertain wave. Martha nodded back, but kept her focus on her destination on the corner of Main Street, where Turner often parked his patrol car during his lunch break. As she rounded the corner, she saw him leaning against the side of the car, sipping from a coffee cup. He spotted her almost immediately, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He straightened up, his gaze flicking over her with casual disdain. "Well, well, Mrs. Johnson, what brings you out here on such a fine day?" he drawled, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. Martha stepped closer, ignoring the tightness in her chest. She met his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "I came to talk to you, Officer Turner, about Jack Collins." He raised an eyebrow, leaning back against his car with a smug grin. "Oh, and what's there to talk about?" "That boy's bad news, Mrs. Johnson. He doesn't belong here, and you're only going to get hurt if you keep him around." Martha's jaw tightened, and she stepped closer, her voice firm. "I don't think you understand, Turner. Jack's a good man, and he's done nothing but help me and Henry. You've got no right to keep harassing him. Or me, for that matter." Turner's smile faltered, and a shadow passed over his expression. He stepped forward, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can stand there and tell me what I can and can't do, Mrs. Johnson? I'm the law in this town, and Jack, he's a nobody. You'd be smart to remember that." Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself as she looked him directly in the eye. "You're wrong, Turner. Jack's got more courage and decency in him than you ever will. And if you think I'm afraid of you, you're mistaken. You can spread your rumors, make your threats, but you won't scare me off. Not from what's right." For a moment, Turner seemed genuinely taken aback, as if he couldn't believe that Martha, this quiet elderly woman, would dare to challenge him. His expression hardened, and he took a step closer, his breath hot on her face. "You don't know who you're dealing with, lady." Martha refused to flinch. "Neither do you, Turner, and I won't let you hurt Jack anymore." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heart racing but her head held high. She didn't look back, even as she heard Turner mutter something under his breath, the words lost in the wind. She had said what she needed to say, and she prayed that it would be enough to keep Turner at bay. As Martha made her way home, her hands shook slightly, but there was a new sense of strength in her step. She knew that Turner wouldn't back down easily, but she also knew that she was no longer alone in this fight. Jack had shown her that there was still room for courage in her heart, and she would keep standing up for him as long as it took. The tension between Jack and Turner only seemed to escalate after Martha's confrontation. Turner made a point of driving past the Johnson house more frequently, his patrol car lingering outside their gate, as if daring them to respond. But Jack and Martha held firm, refusing to let him intimidate them. Despite the pressure, Jack continued to make progress in his recovery. His job at the community center became a lifeline, offering him a chance to rebuild his self-esteem. He struck up a friendship with Tom, the center's manager, a kind-hearted man in his 50s who saw potential in Jack. One afternoon, as Jack mopped the hallway floors, Tom leaned against the wall, watching him with a thoughtful expression. "You're doing good work here, Jack. We could use a man like you full-time if you're interested." Jack paused, blinking in surprise. He turned to face Tom, hope flickering in his chest. "Full-time? You serious?" Tom chuckled, folding his arms. "Dead serious. I've seen how you've been pulling yourself up one step at a time, and the kids at the after-school program like having you around. Gives them someone to look up to." Jack couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. It had been so long since he'd felt like he was worth something, like he had a future beyond just getting through the next day. "I'd love that, Tom. Thank you." The prospect of steady work filled Jack with a renewed sense of purpose, and he shared the news with Martha and Henry that evening over dinner. Martha beamed with pride as she served the stew, and Henry's eyes crinkled at the corners, his silent approval clear. As Jack sat at the table, eating the warm meal that Martha had prepared, he realized how far he had come. There were still bad days, days when the memories of his time overseas or the weight of his past failures threatened to drag him down. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. But Turner had no intention of letting Jack enjoy this new peace. A week later, as Jack was leaving the community center after a long shift, he found Turner waiting for him in the parking lot. The air was chilly and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Jack's heart clenched as he saw Turner leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed and a smug smile playing on his lips. He stole himself, refusing to let his fear show, and walked toward his truck. "Collins!" Turner called out, his voice echoing through the empty lot. "You think you can just ignore me and go on like nothing happened?" Jack stopped, turning to face Turner. "I've got nothing to say to you, Turner. Just leave me alone." Turner pushed off the car, striding forward until he was standing uncomfortably close to Jack. His expression darkened, and he jabbed a finger into Jack's chest. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You think just because that old woman's taken you in, you're better than the rest of us?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "I never claimed to be a hero. I'm just trying to live my life without you breathing down my neck." Turner's smile twisted into a sneer. "You don't belong here, Collins. You never will, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Something inside Jack snapped. He had held back his anger for so long, trying to keep his head down, trying not to make waves. But this time, he felt the weight of all the times he'd been pushed down, humiliated, treated like less than nothing. He stepped closer, meeting Turner's gaze with a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You don't scare me, Turner," Jack said, his voice low but firm, "and you never will. You can try to push me out, but you won't make me run away. Not this time." Turner's face reddened with anger, and for a moment Jack thought he might lash out. But then Turner let out a derisive laugh, turning away with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You're not worth it, Collins. Just don't get too comfortable. This town's got a way of chewing people like you up and spitting them out." As Turner climbed into his patrol car and drove away, Jack stood in the fading light, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back his rage. He knew that Turner wouldn't give up easily, but Martha's words echoed in his mind. "We stand together." When he returned home that night, Martha was waiting for him on the porch, her silhouette framed by the warm glow from the living room window. She looked up as he approached, seeing the tension in his face. "Did he bother you again?" she asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Jack nodded, but then he took a deep breath and managed a small smile. "Yeah, he did. But you know what? I'm not afraid of him anymore. Not as long as I've got you and Henry by my side." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached out to take his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And we're not afraid either, Jack. Not as long as we're together." As they stood on the porch, the night air cooled around them. Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew there were still battles ahead, but he also knew that he wouldn't have to face them alone. Jack settled into his routine at the community center, finding solace in the steady work and the companionship of Tom and the kids who visited after school. Each day he felt more like himself, a version of himself that he thought he'd lost forever. He was even starting to make plans for the future, saving up enough money to get his own place, continuing to work on his sobriety, and doing his best to keep peace with Turner. But Turner had other plans. Over the weeks, the officer's hostility became less subtle. He began showing up at Jack's workplace, finding reasons to stop by the community center. He'd wander through the halls, checking for violations that didn't exist, making snide remarks to Tom about Jack's reliability, his past, and whether he was really as reformed as he seemed. One evening, Jack was finishing up his shift, wiping down the tables in the community room, when he heard Turner's voice behind him. The officer leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "Working late again, Collins?" Turner asked, his tone casual but filled with malice. You sure you're not slipping a little cash under the table while you're at it? Got to fund those old habits somehow, right? Jack froze, his grip tightening on the rag in his hand. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he forced himself to keep his voice calm. I'm just doing my job, Turner. Why don't you let me do that in peace? Turner's smile widened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, taunting whisper. You think you've got everyone fooled, don't you? But I know what you are, Collins. I know how people like you work. You might have Martha and Tom wrapped around your finger, but you'll slip up. And when you do, I'll be right there to remind them who you really are. Jack clenched his fists, struggling to hold back the words he wanted to throw in Turner's face. He thought of Martha, Henry, and all they had done for him. He thought of the progress he'd made, the steps he had taken to be better. He wouldn't let Turner undo all of that. Believe whatever you want, Turner, Jack said, forcing his voice to stay steady. But I'm not going anywhere, not this time. Turner's expression darkened, and he leaned closer, his voice filled with barely contained rage. We'll see about that, Collins. We'll see. He turned on his heel and stalked out of the room, leaving Jack standing in the empty community center, his hands trembling with the effort of keeping his anger in check. Turner's words echoed in his mind, but Jack pushed them away, focusing instead on what Martha had told him time and time again. We stand together. 2 weeks later, Jack was taking out the trash behind the community center when he heard Turner's voice again. But this time, there was something different about the officer's tone, an edge of triumph that made Jack's blood run cold. Hey, Collins, Turner called, stepping out from behind his patrol car, which was parked in the alleyway. Got a little message for you. Jack turned to face him, a knot forming in his stomach. What do you want, Turner? Turner held up a piece of paper, waving it in Jack's face with a smug grin. Looks like you've got a warrant out for unpaid fines. Seems like you never quite cleaned up after all, did you? Jack's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the paper. He knew there was no truth to Turner's claims. He had settled all his debts before starting at the community center. But Turner's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, and Jack realized that this was another attempt to trap him, to push him out of town for good. Those fines are a lie, Turner, Jack shot back, trying to keep his voice steady. And you know it. Turner shrugged, tucking the paper back into his pocket. Well, I guess that's for the judge to decide. Unless, of course, you'd rather make this easy and leave town before things get messy. The threat hung in the air, and Jack felt a surge of rage so intense it almost made him dizzy. But instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath, meeting Turner's gaze with all the defiance he could muster. I'm not leaving, Jack said firmly. I have people here who believe in me, and I'm not about to let you take that away. Turner's smirk faltered, and he took a step closer, his face inches from Jack's. You'll regret this, Collins. You're nothing but a washed-up drunk, and the sooner this town sees that, the better. As Turner turned to leave, Jack felt a new kind of determination settle in his chest. He wouldn't run this time. He wouldn't let Turner tear down everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. He had found a place here, with Martha and Henry, and he wasn't going to give that up without a fight. The confrontation with Turner left Jack shaken, but as he drove back to the Johnson house that evening, he realized that he wasn't afraid anymore. He had something worth fighting for, and he would stand on his ground no matter what Turner threw at him. The following week, Turner made good on his threats, spreading rumors around town that Jack had been caught stealing from the community center. The accusations quickly reached Martha, who heard the whispers at the grocery store and saw the judgmental looks cast in Jack's direction whenever he walked through town. Martha confronted Emma White outside White's grocery one afternoon, her voice shaking with anger. What's this nonsense I've been hearing about Jack? He's been nothing but a help to me and Henry. Why is Turner spreading these lies? Emma shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Martha's gaze. It's not me, Martha. You know how Turner is. He's got a lot of influence, and people listen to him. They believe him when he says Jack is trouble. Martha crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. Well, I don't believe it, and neither should anyone else. That boy has done more good in the past few months than Turner has in years. Emma looked up, her expression softening. I know you mean well, Martha, but be careful. Turner doesn't take kindly to people who stand in his way. Martha met Emma's eyes, her expression resolute. I'm not afraid of him, Emma, and neither is Jack. As Martha walked home that evening, she felt a surge of determination. She had seen the way Turner's lies were affecting Jack, how his shoulders hunched a little more when he walked through town, how the hope in his eyes seemed to dim. But she wouldn't let Turner win. Not when Jack had fought so hard to build a new life. When she reached the house, she found Jack sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the sunset. She joined him, setting down 2 cups of tea, and placed a hand on his arm. I heard what Turner's been saying about you, she said softly, and I want you to know, Jack, that none of it matters. You've made us proud, and nothing he says can change that. Jack looked down at his hands, struggling to hold back the emotions that welled up inside him. It's just hard sometimes, Martha, to keep believing that I'm worth something, that I can be better than who I used to be. Martha squeezed his arm, her voice filled with warmth. You already are better, Jack, and Henry and I, we're better because of you. Jack took a deep breath, letting her words wash over him like a balm. He looked out at the darkening sky, feeling a small spark of hope rekindle in his chest. Martha's unwavering support gave him the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for the life he had started to build. And as they sat together on the porch, watching the first stars appear, Jack realized that no matter what Turner did, he wouldn't give up. He had found a new family here, and that was worth everything. Jack tried to hold on to Martha's words as he went about his days, but Turner's shadow loomed larger with each passing week. The rumors spread through town like slow poison, turning friendly nods from neighbors into wary glances. Even Tom at the community center, who had been so supportive, began to look at Jack with a flicker of doubt in his eyes. One evening, as Jack was leaving the community center, Tom stopped him by the front door, his expression troubled. The evening sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, and Jack felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. Listen, Jack, Tom began, scratching the back of his neck. You know I've always thought you were doing a good job here, but, well, there's been talk around town. People are saying things about you, and it's making some of the board members nervous. Jack felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's all Turner, Tom. He's got it out for me. You know I'd never steal anything or hurt anyone. Tom sighed, looking genuinely conflicted. I believe you, Jack, but I've got to keep the peace around here. Maybe it'd be best if you laid low for a bit, just until things cool down. Jack's heart clenched at the thought of losing the one place where he'd started to feel like he belonged, but he saw the strain in Tom's face and knew that his friend was caught between loyalty and pressure from the town. Yeah, okay, Jack said finally, forcing a small, tight smile. I get it. I'll take a few days off. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, relieved. Thanks, Jack. I know it's not fair, but we'll get through this. Jack nodded, but as he walked to his truck, the weight of the situation settled over him like a shroud. He knew that Turner wouldn't be satisfied until he was run out of town, and now it seemed like he was one step closer to getting what he wanted. The next day, Martha watched Jack pacing in the front yard, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, frustration radiating off him in waves. Henry watched too, his sharp eyes following Jack's movements from his place by the window. Martha had shared with him what Tom had said, and she could see the pain in Jack's expression. The pain of being pushed out of yet another place where he had tried to find his footing. She stepped outside, bracing herself against the cool autumn wind, and joined Jack on the porch. You're wearing a hole in the grass, she said gently, trying to lighten the mood. Jack stopped, turning to face her, his expression bleak. I just don't get it, Martha. I'm doing everything right this time, working hard, staying sober, and still it's like Turner's everywhere, whispering in people's ears, turning them against me. Martha reached out, placing a hand on his arm, feeling the tension thrumming beneath his skin. It's not you, Jack. It's him. He's trying to make you feel small, to make you forget all the progress you've made. But you're stronger than that. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope, as if he was searching for something to hold on to. I don't know how much longer I can take it, Martha. I'm so tired of fighting. Martha's heart ached at the pain in his voice, and she squeezed his arm, offering him a soft, steady smile. You're not alone in this, Jack. We'll find a way through. And if Turner thinks he can push you out of this town, he's got another thing coming. Just then, the sound of a car engine rumbled down the road, and Martha turned to see Turner's patrol car cruising slowly past the house, his eyes fixed on them. He didn't stop, but his smirk was unmistakable, a silent promise that he wasn't finished yet. Jack's fists clenched at his sides and Martha placed a calming hand on his shoulder, but she knew that Turner's constant presence was wearing him down. She just hoped that Jack could hold on to his strength long enough to see that he wasn't fighting alone. 3 days later, Martha and Jack found themselves at White's grocery, stocking up on supplies. Martha had convinced Jack to join her on the trip, hoping that a change of scenery might help take his mind off things. But as they stood in the checkout line, Martha noticed a few townspeople whispering, their eyes flicking toward Jack and then quickly away. She reached out, giving Jack's arm a reassuring squeeze, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his jaw clenched as he kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Just as Martha was about to make a pointed comment to the gawking customers, the doorbell above the entrance chimed, and Officer Turner strode into the store, his boots echoing against the linoleum floor. The air seemed to go still, and Martha felt her heart thump in her chest as Turner approached the counter, his smirk firmly in place. He looked from Martha to Jack, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Well, well, if it isn't my favorite duo," Turner said loudly, his voice carrying through the quiet store. "Hope you're not causing too much trouble in here, Collins." The tension in the room was palpable, and Jack's fists tightened at his sides. Martha took a step forward, her expression hardening. "We're just here to do our shopping, Officer Turner. Nothing more." Turner ignored her, keeping his focus on Jack. "You know, Collins, I heard you're taking a little break from the community center. Guess they finally figured out what kind of man they're dealing with." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Martha beat him to it, her voice ringing with uncharacteristic force. "That's enough, Turner. You've said your piece. Now leave us alone." A few customers gasped at Martha's boldness, and Turner's smile twisted into a sneer. He took a step closer, towering over her, and Jack moved to position himself between them, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "You think you can stand up to me, Mrs. Johnson?" Turner hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You think that old man of yours or this washed-up veteran can protect you?" Martha held her ground, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised even herself. "I think I've had enough of your threats, Turner. You can push and push, but you're the one who should be ashamed." Turner's face flushed red, and he seemed ready to lash out, but then a voice cut through the tension, a young woman's, firm and unwavering. "That's enough, Turner." Everyone turned to see Emma White standing behind the counter, her arms crossed over her chest, her face set with determination. Her voice was loud enough that the entire store went silent, and Turner's expression shifted from anger to surprise. "Emma, you don't want to get involved in this," Turner said, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his tone. But Emma didn't back down. "Actually, I do, because I'm tired of you bullying people in my store. Jack hasn't done anything wrong, and neither has Martha. So why don't you leave them alone?" A murmur ran through the other customers, and Turner looked around, suddenly aware that the tide of public opinion might be turning against him. He glared at Jack one last time, but Jack stood tall, a new strength in his posture. Without another word, Turner turned on his heel and marched out of the store, his face flushed with anger. As the door swung shut behind him, the tension in the room eased, and Emma let out a shaky breath. Martha turned to her, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Emma. I didn't expect you to step in like that." Emma managed a small, sheepish smile. "It's about time someone did. Besides, I've known Turner long enough to see what kind of man he really is." As Jack looked around at the townspeople, some of whom offered small, encouraging nods, he realized that Turner's grip on the town wasn't as strong as he thought. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd feared. He turned to Martha, who squeezed his arm with a proud smile, and he knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't back down. Turner might still be a threat, but he had allies now, people who believed in him, who had seen the man he was trying to become. As they left the store together, Jack felt a flicker of hope settling in his chest. burning brighter than it had in a long, long time. The air in town shifted after the confrontation at White's grocery. Word spread quickly about Turner's behavior, and while some remained loyal to him, many began to question his heavy-handed tactics and the way he seemed to target Jack. The whispered gossip that had once been focused on Jack now turned toward Turner, casting doubt on the officer's integrity. For Martha, the change brought a small but significant sense of relief. When she and Jack went out in public, more people greeted them with cautious smiles or small nods of respect. Emma's stand in the store had marked a turning point, and Martha saw the way Jack straightened his back a little more, his shoulders losing some of their familiar slump. Yet Turner's presence still lingered like a dark cloud over their lives. He continued to make his rounds through the neighborhood, his patrol car idling near the Johnson house at odd hours, a silent reminder that he wasn't finished with them. Jack knew that Turner was waiting for him to slip up, to give him an excuse to swoop in and arrest him for some invented offense. One evening, as Martha prepared dinner, Jack sat by Henry's bed, speaking softly to the older man while he adjusted his pillows. Henry watched him intently, his sharp eyes glimmering with a kind of paternal pride that Jack had rarely seen directed his way. "Guess we're in for a tough road, Mr. Johnson," Jack murmured, more to himself than to Henry. "Turner isn't backing down, but maybe this time we don't have to back down either." He glanced over his shoulder at Martha, who was humming quietly in the kitchen, her back turned as she stirred a pot on the stove. He thought about the sacrifices she had made for Henry, the way she had embraced him into their home despite her own fears. The weight of her trust settled heavily in Jack's chest, but it also filled him with a renewed determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the family that had given him a second chance. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Jack sat on the porch, looking out at the dark, quiet street. He pulled out his phone, staring at the contact number he had found earlier that day, the county commissioner's office. He had debated calling, wondering if anyone would take him seriously, if they would even listen to the accusations he had against Turner. But as he thought about Martha's unwavering support, he took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang, and after a few moments, a weary voice answered on the other end. "Commissioner's office, how can I help you?" Jack swallowed, steeling himself. "Yes, I'd like to report misconduct by an officer in our town. His name is Ray Turner, and I think you need to hear what he's been doing." As Jack began to recount the months of harassment, the way Turner had manipulated the town against him, he felt a sense of purpose settle into his bones, a determination to stand up, not just for himself, but for the life he was trying to build. The voice on the other end listened intently, asking careful questions, and by the time the call ended, Jack felt like he had taken the first real step in fighting back. He didn't tell Martha about the call right away, not wanting to get her hopes up if nothing came of it. But over the next week, he noticed more unfamiliar cars parked outside the community center and men in suits visiting Tom's office to ask questions. Rumors began to spread that the county was investigating Turner, and for the first time, Jack felt like he might have a chance to turn the tables. A week later, Martha received an invitation from the local veterans group asking Henry, Jack, and herself to attend a small ceremony in honor of Henry's service. The letter came as a surprise. Martha hadn't expected anyone to reach out to them, not after everything that had happened. But she could see the excitement in Jack's eyes when she showed him the invitation, a spark of hope that she hadn't seen in months. "Think we should go, Martha?" Jack asked, holding the invitation carefully in his hands. "It's been a while since Henry got out of the house, but I think he'd like it." Martha nodded, her voice soft with emotion. "I think so too, Jack. It's been so long since Henry was recognized for what he's given to this country. I think he'd be proud to go, and to have you there with him." On the day of the ceremony, Martha, Jack, and Henry made their way to the town's small Veterans Memorial Park. Jack helped Martha wheel Henry's chair over the uneven grass, guiding them to a place near the front. A modest crowd had gathered. Other veterans, a few local families, and members of the Veterans Association. Turner was there too, standing off to the side in his uniform, his expression unreadable. Jack felt the familiar prickle of tension at the back of his neck, but he forced himself to focus on Martha and Henry, determined not to let Turner ruin the day. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. An older veteran in a faded Marine uniform spoke about the sacrifices made by servicemen like Henry, how they had given so much to protect the freedoms that others often took for granted. He spoke of resilience, of the courage to face each day, even when the battlefields of war gave way to the quieter battles of life. When Henry's name was called, Jack helped wheel him forward. Martha's eyes shone with tears as she watched Jack stand by Henry's side, and she thought of all the struggles they had faced together, the dark days, the long nights, the moments when they had almost given up. Now she saw a new strength in Jack, a determination that hadn't been there before, and it filled her with a fierce, unyielding pride. As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but Jack noticed Turner watching them from a distance, his arms crossed and a cold sneer playing at the edges of his lips. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, and he knew that whatever victory he had gained today, Turner wouldn't let it go easily. But then Jack saw a familiar face moving through the crowd. Tom, the community center manager, along with a few men in suits who had been asking questions about Turner. They exchanged quiet words with Turner, and Jack saw the way the officer's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he realized what was happening. One of the men, a county investigator, approached Jack and Martha as Turner stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. "Mr. Collins? Mrs. Johnson?" the investigator said, offering a small, polite nod. "I just wanted to thank you for coming forward. We've been looking into the allegations against Officer Turner, and it's been illuminating." Jack felt a surge of relief and disbelief, barely daring to hope that this might actually change things. "So, what happens now?" The investigator glanced toward Turner, who was now standing by his patrol car, his face flushed with anger. "We'll be recommending that Turner be suspended pending further investigation. It's clear that he's crossed some serious lines." As the investigator walked away, Martha turned to Jack, her hand tightening around his. "You did it, Jack. You stood up to him, and now maybe things can change." Jack looked down at Martha, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of hope that felt almost too fragile to hold. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha. You and Henry, you gave me the strength to fight." They watched together as Turner drove away, the shadows of his influence fading with each turn of his wheels. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had a future where he wasn't running from his past but standing tall with a family that believed in him. The news of Turner's suspension spread quickly through the small town. Whispers filled the grocery store aisles, the post office, and the diner on Main Street. The man who had once seemed untouchable, who had controlled the narrative of Jack's life for months, was finally facing scrutiny from the county. For many it was a shock, but for others there was a sense of justice, long overdue and well-deserved. For Jack, the suspension brought a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had spent so long fighting to reclaim his dignity, and now that Turner was out of the picture, he found himself struggling to adjust to the absence of the constant tension that had filled his days. He still carried the fear that Turner might come back, that the investigation could somehow turn against him. But Martha's quiet strength kept him anchored, and Henry's steady presence reminded him of how far he had come. One crisp afternoon, Jack and Martha took Henry out for a walk around their neighborhood. It was something they hadn't done in years. Henry's condition had often kept them confined to the house. But with Jack's help, the world beyond their front porch had opened up again. Martha guided Henry's wheelchair down the sidewalk, while Jack walked beside her, pushing the chair over uneven patches of pavement. The three of them made their way to the town square, where a few families were enjoying the late afternoon sun. Jack noticed Emma White sitting on a bench with her young daughter, and she waved when she saw them, a warm smile lighting up her face. Martha returned the wave, her own smile widening as she turned to Jack. "Feels like the town is waking up again, doesn't it?" she said, her voice carrying a note of hope that made Jack's chest tighten. Jack nodded, looking around at the familiar streets and the people who no longer glanced at him with suspicion. "Yeah, it does. And I think I might finally feel like I belong here, Martha. Thanks to you and Henry." As they reached the edge of the square, Jack spotted a few of the kids from the community center playing soccer, their laughter echoing across the open space. Tom, the community center manager, stood nearby, talking with a couple of parents. When he caught sight of Jack, He lifted a hand in greeting, his expression warm. Tom walked over, clapping Jack on the back. Good to see you out here, Jack. How's it going? Jack managed a small smile, glancing at Martha and Henry beside him. It's getting better, Tom. Thanks for sticking by me, even when things got rough. Tom shrugged, but his smile softened with sincerity. We all have rough patches, Jack. What matters is that you didn't give up, and now maybe we can finally put all this behind us. Jack nodded, feeling a flicker of hope deep in his chest. But even as he tried to focus on the positive, a part of him knew that there was still one loose end that needed to be tied up. Turner. He hadn't seen the officer since the suspension, but he knew in his gut that Turner wouldn't disappear quietly. There was still unfinished business between them, and Jack wasn't sure how it would play out. That evening, as they returned home, Jack found himself pacing the front porch, the autumn air cool against his skin. Martha noticed his restless energy and joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she stepped outside. You're worried about him, aren't you? Martha asked, her voice gentle. About Turner. Jack nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I am. I know he's been suspended, but I just can't shake the feeling that he's not done with me yet. I keep expecting him to show up, looking for a fight. Martha reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Whatever happens, Jack, we'll face it together. You're not that same man who came to us looking for a place to hide. You've found your strength again, and you've given us hope too. Jack looked down at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and love for this woman who had taken him in, who had seen the good in him even when he couldn't see it himself. He squeezed her hand, nodding slowly. Thank you, Martha. I just hope you're right. The next day dawned gray and cool, a heavy mist hanging over the town. Jack had just finished tidying up the front yard when he heard the rumble of an engine coming up the street. He looked up, his stomach twisting with dread as he recognized the familiar shape of Turner's patrol car. The car came to a stop in front of the Johnson house, and Turner stepped out, his expression hard and unreadable. He wasn't in uniform. He had been stripped of that authority for the time being. But the look in his eyes told Jack that he was still every bit as dangerous. Jack took a deep breath, stepping down from the porch to meet Turner in the driveway. Martha appeared at the door, her face pale with worry, but Jack gave her a reassuring nod. He didn't want her getting involved in this, not if it could be avoided. What do you want, Turner? Jack asked, keeping his voice steady, even though his heart pounded in his chest. Turner crossed his arms, a bitter smile twisting his lips. You think you've won, don't you, Collins? You think just because you've got a few people on your side, you've beaten me. But you haven't. You're still the same pathetic loser you've always been. Jack felt a flash of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm, to hold his ground. I'm not looking for a fight, Turner. Whatever you've got against me, it's over. You're not the law anymore. Turner's eyes narrowed and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think I need a badge to put you back in your place? Jack felt a surge of fear, but he refused to back down. He thought of Martha and Henry, of the home they had given him, the strength they had helped him find. He thought of all the times he had run from confrontation, from his own mistakes, and he realized that this time he couldn't run. He had to stand up, for himself, for the family that had given him a second chance. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Turner, Jack said, his voice growing steadier with each word. You've tried to take everything from me, but you failed. And you know why? Because I'm not the man you think I am. I'm stronger than that, and I've got people who believe in me. For a moment, Turner seemed genuinely taken aback, as if he hadn't expected Jack to speak with such conviction. But then his expression twisted with rage, and he took a step forward, raising a fist. Before Turner could strike, Martha's voice rang out behind Jack, sharp and filled with unyielding determination. That's enough, Turner. If you lay a hand on him, I'll have the sheriff down here in minutes. Turner froze, glancing past Jack to where Martha stood on the porch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes blazed with anger, and Jack could see the fierceness in her that had carried her through so many of life's challenges. For a long, tense moment, the three of them stood in the driveway, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then Turner seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging as he let out a bitter laugh. You think you've beaten me, Collins? He muttered, his voice filled with venom. You haven't. You're just lucky this old woman took pity on you." With that, he turned on his heel, stomping back to his car. He climbed inside and slammed the door, revving the engine before speeding away down the street, his tires kicking up gravel. Jack and Martha watched him go, the tension slowly draining from the air. When the car disappeared around the corner, Jack let out a shaky breath, turning to Martha with a look of disbelief. "You didn't have to do that, Martha. He could have—" Martha shook her head, stepping forward to take his hands in hers. "Yes, I did, Jack. Because you're worth fighting for. You always have been." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, and he wrapped his arms around Martha, pulling her into a tight embrace. She held him just as fiercely, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he was finally free. Free from Turner's threats, free from the ghosts of his past. As they stood there, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the Johnson house. It felt like a promise of a new beginning, a future where Jack, Martha, and Henry could finally find peace. And as Jack looked out at the familiar town he had come to call home, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. The seasons turned, and with them came a quiet peace that settled over the Johnson household. Winter's chill gave way to the gentle warmth of spring, and the days grew longer, filled with the soft murmur of birds returning to the trees that lined their quiet street. The town itself seemed to breathe easier, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders now that Turner's influence had waned. Jack embraced the rhythm of his new life, feeling a sense of stability he had almost forgotten was possible. He continued his job at the community center, now on a full-time basis, thanks to Tom's support and the goodwill of the parents who saw the positive impact he had on their children. He also remained dedicated to his sobriety, attending his weekly AIA meetings with a renewed sense of purpose. Each day was still a challenge, but Jack faced it with a kind of quiet determination, knowing that he had a future worth fighting for. The days in the Johnson home were filled with small but meaningful routines. Martha baking fresh loaves of bread and sharing stories over breakfast. Jack working on repairs around the house or reading to Henry in the afternoons. And evenings spent together on the porch, watching the sky fade into soft hues of orange and pink. Henry's condition had not improved, but the presence of Jack brought a new light into his days. Though he couldn't speak, the silent exchanges between him and Jack spoke volumes, a bond forged through shared understanding and the unspoken gratitude for each other's company. One bright spring morning, Martha came into the kitchen to find Jack standing by the window, a thoughtful expression on his face as he looked out over the blooming garden. Martha placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, her hands still dusted with flour from the biscuits she had been making. "You're up early," she remarked, settling into the chair across from him. Jack glanced at her and smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I couldn't sleep. Just thinking about how far things have come since everything." Martha nodded, understanding the unspoken words that lingered between them. She reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "You've done well, Jack. I hope you know that. Henry and we couldn't have asked for a better friend." Jack's throat tightened with emotion, and he looked down at their clasped hands. "I wouldn't have made it without you and Henry, Martha. You gave me a place to belong when I didn't think I'd ever find that again." Martha squeezed his hand gently, her eyes warm with unspoken pride. "You earned it, Jack. Every bit of it. And no matter what happens, you'll always have a place here. We're family." The word family settled in Jack's heart like a balm, soothing the old wounds that still ached on quiet nights. He had never imagined finding a sense of belonging in a place like this, in a small town that had once felt so hostile, in the home of a couple who had opened their door to a stranger in need. But here he was, standing on the other side of his darkest days, with the promise of a future that felt brighter than he had ever dared to hope. In the weeks that followed, Jack found new ways to give back to the town that had gradually come to accept him. He volunteered to coach a youth soccer team at the community center, drawing on his experience as a mechanic to help the kids build makeshift goals from old pipes and scrap wood. He even found time to fix up Martha's old garden shed, transforming it into a small workshop where he could tinker with repairs for neighbors who needed a helping hand. And while Turner had been suspended from his position as an officer, he remained a distant presence, choosing to stay away from Jack and the Johnsons. The county's investigation had revealed enough to keep him from regaining his former authority. But Jack knew that the bitterness in Turner's heart hadn't disappeared. Yet Jack had learned to let go of that fear, to accept that some battles would always linger, but that he didn't have to fight them alone. One afternoon, as Jack was packing up the soccer equipment at the community center, Tom walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Hey, Jack," Tom began, a hint of pride in his voice. "I've been thinking. We've got a new after-school program starting up next fall, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in a leadership role. The kids look up to you, and I think you'd be a great mentor." Jack felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest, and he managed to smile, still amazed at how much his life had changed. "I'd be honored, Tom. Really, I would. Thanks for believing in me." Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his smile genuine. "You've earned it, Jack, and it's good to see you smiling again." As Jack watched the kids scatter across the field, laughing and playing in the golden afternoon light, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to dream about the future, to imagine a life where he could be a positive force, where he could give back to a community that had, in its own way, offered him a second chance. Back at the Johnson house, life settled into a comfortable rhythm, each day bringing small joys and the warmth of companionship. One sunny afternoon, Martha found herself sitting on the porch, a glass of lemonade in her hand, while Jack trimmed the hedges along the front yard. She glanced over at Henry, who was propped up in his chair, his eyes half closed as he dozed in the sunlight. Martha smiled softly, watching the way Jack moved with ease now, no longer weighed down by the shadows of his past. She thought back to the day when he had first appeared on their doorstep, worn down and uncertain, and she marveled at how far they had all come since then. She thought of Henry's silent but unwavering support, of the love that had carried them through the hardest years, and she felt a quiet gratitude that filled her heart to overflowing. She turned to Jack as he finished his work, calling out to him with a playful tone. "Jack, you missed a spot there." He glanced over his shoulder, catching her teasing grin, and laughed. "I'll get to it, Martha. Don't you worry." As Jack put away the tools and joined Martha on the porch, she handed him a glass of lemonade, and they sat together, enjoying the simple pleasure of the warm breeze. The town stretched out before them, quiet and peaceful, and Martha felt a sense of contentment settle over her, like a soft blanket. "Do you think Turner will ever come back?" Martha asked after a while, her voice thoughtful. Jack considered the question, then shook his head. "I don't know, Martha, but if he does, I'm ready for him. And this time, I'm not facing him alone." Martha smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "You've found your place here, Jack, and no one can take that from you now." They sat in companionable silence for a long while, listening to the distant sound of children playing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jack thought of the journey that had brought him here, of the struggles that had nearly broken him, and of the unexpected kindness that had helped him rebuild his life. He thought of Martha and Henry, of the home they had shared with him, and he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with a sense of purpose and strength that he had once thought lost forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Jack, Martha, and Henry remained on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of gold and pink. They knew that life would never be without its difficulties, that Turner's presence might still linger in the back of their minds. But they also knew that they had found something far more powerful than fear, a sense of hope, of resilience, of a future they could build together. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him, like the gentle warmth of a long-forgotten embrace. He reached out, taking Martha's hand, and together they sat in the quiet of the evening, knowing that no matter what tomorrow brought, they had already found their way home. As Jack, Martha, and Henry sat on the porch, watching the last light of the day fade away, a sense of peace settled over them, a reminder that no matter the challenges, hope could still blossom in unexpected places. And if you enjoyed this story of resilience, community, and finding hope when it's needed most, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more heartfelt tales just like this. Join us on this journey and never miss a moment of the stories that celebrate the power of kindness and the strength of the human spirit. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you for being a part of this story. We'll see you in the next one.